President Trump will sign his Speak Beautiful bill into law today after kicking off America's 250th celebrations in Iowa last night.
In a few moments, we're going to make official the greatest victory yet when I sign the one big, beautiful.
The Independence Day fireworks had barely faded when Washington unleashed what could become the most devastating trade ultimatum in modern history. President Trump's administration prepared to activate a tariff framework that threatens to reshape global commerce forever, targeting multiple nations with duties ranging from 10 to 70%. This isn't just another trade dispute. We're looking at a potential $1.3 trillion disruption to worldwide supply chains, with effects that could ripple through every major economy on Earth. The stakes have never been higher, and the timeline is brutally short. Welcome back to Exposing Truth, where we dive deep into the stories that mainstream media won't fully explore. Today we're uncovering the real strategy behind these massive tariff threats and examining how one quiet leader might be turning the tables on the world's most powerful nation. The ultimatum was clear and unforgiving. Multiple countries faced an impossible choice: sign comprehensive trade agreements immediately or face punitive tariffs that could cripple their economies. The deadline was set for August 1st, giving negotiators mere weeks to restructure decades of established trade relationships. Within 48 hours of the announcement, panic spread across global capitals. The United Kingdom moved first, frantically negotiating a deal to protect 100,000 vehicles per year with preferential 10% rates. Vietnam quickly followed, accepting 20 to 40% duties on specific goods to avoid complete economic isolation from American markets. But one major player remained conspicuously silent. While other nations scrambled to appease Washington, Canada's leadership chose a dramatically different approach that would either prove brilliant or catastrophic. Prime Minister Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, refused to jose. In the desperate rush for quick agreements, instead of panic, his government displayed calculated patience that seemed almost reckless given the enormous economic threats hanging over the relationship. The Canadian strategy became clear through a series of carefully orchestrated moves that began even before the formal ultimatum arrived. On June 30th, Ottawa quietly eliminated the 3% digital services tax that had targeted major American technology companies, including Amazon, Google, and Meta. This wasn't surrender, but strategic positioning. The tax elimination restarted negotiations while sending a message that Canada was willing to make calculated concessions without abandoning core interests. The move caught Washington off guard and forced a reassessment of their negotiating assumptions. Rather than rushing into provisional agreements like other nations, Carney's team deliberately slowed the technical negotiation process. Meeting schedules were pushed indefinitely, briefing documents grew increasingly complex, and American negotiators found themselves revealing additional demands they had hoped to keep hidden. The strategy was working. While Trump's team celebrated quick wins with Britain and Vietnam, analysts noted these agreements represented barely 1% of total American imports. The real prize remained elusive as Canada continued its careful dance around Washington's ultimatum. Behind closed doors, Ottawa was fortifying its position in ways that would soon shock American negotiators. The Canadian House of Commons held 3 secret hearings focused on protecting the country's agricultural quota system, particularly the dairy sector that employs hundreds of thousands of workers. Under intense pressure from agricultural interests, Canadian lawmakers passed legislation that would lock supply management protections out of any international agreements. This move effectively removed one of America's primary negotiating objectives from the table, creating what trade advisors called the biggest bottleneck with no clear resolution. The legislative maneuver sent shockwaves through the Oval Office. On July 11th, Trump suddenly escalated the planned tariffs on Canada to 35%, warning they could climb even higher if Ottawa continued its stalling tactics. Carney's response was characteristically measured and devastating in its simplicity. He released figures showing that Canada purchases $349.4 billion in American goods annually, more than Japan and Germany combined. The implication was clear: aggressive tariffs would hurt American businesses and workers just as much as Canadian ones. The numbers told a compelling story that Washington couldn't ignore. Detroit and Chicago supply chains would face immediate disruption if the tariff threats became reality. Michigan's assembly lines, already struggling with various economic pressures, would bear the brunt of any trade war escalation. This economic interdependence became Carney's strongest weapon. He had offered symbolic concessions like the digital tax elimination while erecting legal barriers around strategic assets including dairy, green steel production, and electric vehicle battery manufacturing. Each passing day brought increased pressure from American businesses, particularly technology companies and automotive manufacturers, pushing back against the White House's aggressive timeline. Trump needed quick victories before his August 1st deadline, but Canada's strategy was designed to run down the clock. The pressure was building toward an inevitable confrontation. Would the administration climb down from its 70% threat or escalate to unprecedented levels that could trigger the largest trade war in North American history? The dairy sector became the ultimate red line that neither side could cross without devastating political consequences. Canada's supply management system protects 339,000 jobs through quotas A and import duties exceeding 300% on products above established limits. These aren't just economic statistics, but political realities that determine electoral outcomes in Ontario and Quebec, provinces that control 170 seats in Canada's House of Commons. Every policy decision affecting dairy farmers becomes a matter of political survival for any prime minister. From Washington's perspective, this system represented everything wrong with international trade relationships. The administration branded it protectionist, accusing Ottawa of strangling American farmers with triple-digit tariffs while demanding immediate market access for 15% of Canadian dairy consumption. The political calculations were transparent. Breaking Canada's agricultural protections would provide a trophy for Wisconsin voters while demonstrating American negotiating strength to other trading partners. But Ottawa had prepared a legal trap that would make such victories impossible. On August 8th, Canada's House of Commons passed Bill C-98 by a unanimous vote of 289-0. The legislation, nicknamed the Supply Management Shield, legally prohibited any minister from negotiating quota increases or tariff reductions outside the established system. 3 days later, the Senate approved the bill without opposition. International media called it legislation, with unanimous support that effectively locked down negotiations just before Parliament's summer recess. The timing wasn't accidental. The vote struck Washington like a thunderbolt. Carney had offered bait with the digital services tax elimination, but simultaneously slammed shut the door on dairy access, the product Trump insisted must be opened for any comprehensive agreement. Canada's Agriculture Ministry released devastating analysis showing that breaking quotas could drive domestic milk prices down 18% within 3 months, eliminate 6 billion Canadian dollars in farm values, and threaten 72,000 processing jobs in Quebec City and Toronto. The message to Washington was unmistakable. Touching dairy meant touching Canada's federal foundation. Agricultural organizations launched the Hands Off Our Milk campaign, plastering green and white signs along major highways, turning dairy protection into a political weapon. Across the border, the Oval Office faced an impossible dilemma. Accepting lower tariffs meant conceding to Carney and risking rural American votes during a crucial election period. Going nuclear with 70% tariffs meant Detroit would face an instant $35 billion counterpunch through retaliatory measures on steel and aluminum. A White House advisor admitted to international media that Carney had flipped the negotiating table, forcing America to pay twice by losing bargaining leverage while preparing for ripple effects at major corporations, including General Motors and Walmart, where prices could soar by 50%. This prospect explained how Carney could simply fold his arms during Independence Day celebrations and run down the clock while making Trump sweat. The C-98 legislative shield drove negotiations into a dead end where America must either climb down or face escalating economic and political risks. From the narrow issue of supply management, Carney transformed domestic political strength into international leverage, bouncing 4th of July fireworks back toward the White House and forcing the administration to question whether touching Canada's dairy sector was worth gambling the entire $1.3 trillion supply chain. With less than 2 weeks remaining before the July 21st deadline, Washington continued hammering one figure: 70% maximum punitive tariffs if Canada failed to sign comprehensive agreements. This wasn't empty bluffing, but a carefully calculated threat tested successfully on Britain and Vietnam. For North America's steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors, the threat represented a live explosive device planted under integrated assembly lines. Even a doubling to 50% steel aluminum tariffs had already rattled markets, with Midwest prices jumping 22% in a single month. General Motors had already responded by cutting production shifts, laying off 700 workers, and diverting exports back to American facilities. Company executives called it a mandatory response to new tariff barriers, previewing what 70% duties could trigger. In Windsor, Stellantis delayed major production launches, while Michigan legislators heard chilling forecasts of 13,000 jobs evaporating within 5 years, draining state budgets by $456 million. The human cost was becoming impossible to ignore. Instead of panicking, Prime Minister Carney unveiled a $6.5 billion Canadian defensive package to Parliament. $5 billion would help exporters develop new markets, $1 billion supported agricultural diversification, and $500 million provided concessional loans for affected industries. Insiders revealed that $4 billion was specifically earmarked for Ontario and Quebec's steel, aluminum, and electric vehicle battery manufacturing hub, creating a shield for 30,000 factory jobs when 70% tariffs struck. Simultaneously, Canada's foreign ministry reinforced escape routes by negotiating higher steel quotas with the European Union, reopening free trade discussions with Japan, and establishing a UK-Canada economic working group. The diversification strategy was comprehensive and accelerated. Washington responded by shifting to political warfare, accusing 11 of Canada's 13 provinces of discriminating against American goods while threatening to expand sanctions to softwood lumber, beef, and pharmaceuticals. The media campaign targeted rural American voters already frustrated. Rated by Canada's closed dairy market, Georgetown analysts estimated that pharmaceutical tariffs could increase Big Pharma's raw material costs by $2 billion, risking drug price increases before crucial midterm elections. The political stakes were escalating for both sides. Carney rolled out Plan B instead of hitting panic buttons. At press conferences, he declared that Canada didn't seek confrontation, but would protect workers. The Commerce Ministry launched Diversify 2025, automatically raising European Union export quotas by 15% for companies hit by American tariffs. The market reaction was immediate. The Canadian dollar dropped 1.4%, but major resource companies saw stock prices rise as Ottawa signaled fresh capital support. Labor unions warned that 70% tariffs could eliminate 45,000 jobs in the Windsor-Detroit-Oshawa automotive triangle, potentially pushing Ontario into technical recession. The trade clock was ticking louder with each passing hour. Washington faced a binary choice: de-escalate and accept limited concessions from Ottawa, or pull the 70% trigger and gamble on a twin recession affecting Detroit and Windsor simultaneously. Carney was staking his entire political credibility on steadfast resistance because surviving past July 21st would buy Canada time to cement new free trade agreements, transforming tariff threats into leverage for restructuring supply chains beyond White House reach. If successful, the 70% warning could boomerang back at President Trump during election season, creating political vulnerabilities that careful Canadian strategy had deliberately engineered. Today, the battle between coercive economic might and patient strategic planning plays out starkly along the 49th parallel. Trump's 70% tariff threat targets not just steel, aluminum, or automobiles, but strikes at the resilience of America's longest-standing ally. Conversely, Mark Carney's quiet but unyielding stance sends an unmistakable message. Attempting to force Canada's submission means accepting damage to America's own integrated supply chains. The economic relationship runs too deep for unilateral victories. Should Trump prevail, every world capital will learn to sign agreements hastily for survival, and Capitol Hill will gain fresh precedent for hardball economic diplomacy. But if Ottawa holds firm, the White House must acknowledge that tariffs, however jarring, prove powerless against precisely engineered long-term strategies. July 21st won't merely record a winner, but will determine whether America's most crucial economic alliance survives through dialogue or shatters under tariff ambitions. The outcome will reshape international trade relationships for decades to come. This has been Exposing Truth, bringing you the real stories behind the headlines. What do you think about these unprecedented tariff threats? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for our continued coverage of global political developments that mainstream media won't fully explore.